myelofibrosis is kind of like taking a beach ball and pushing it underneath the water. And the depth that you push it down is how much medicine you're using. And the amount of symptoms or the amount of disease you have is how big the beach ball is. So if you take a beach ball and push it under the water and then you draw your hand away, that beach ball is going to shoot up. And it's going to shoot up higher if you've been using a little more medicine or if your disease is more burdensome. So the idea is to let your hand off that beach ball gently. So that's why we taper, right? And we know that the disease is going to relapse when you take your hand away, those symptoms are going to come to the fore again. But if you do it slowly at least, you're not going to have that kind of shooting up thing. The other thing that Michael may have mentioned, but I didn't hear him, is that we can use other medicines other than ruxolitinib to try and make that taper a little gentler. One of the keys is steroids. And we actually have more experience now from these therapies called CAR cells about how to manage cytokine storms that may not be exactly what the ruxolitinib is, but they can kind of calm down some of the things that when we were first using ruxolitinib came as a surprise to some of the earlier investigators. This doesn't mean that it's not dangerous, but nobody on ruxolitinib should think that I can never come off or that it's catastrophic if I come off. You just have to do it thoughtfully, and you have to do it in concert with your doctor. But anyway, that's on a different topic than I'm supposed to talk about, but it's one of those things that comes up a lot. Am I okay? You're great. Okay, good. Okay, so Anne asked me to talk about clinical trials, and first off, I will admit I stole a lot of these slides from my colleague, Jason Gottlieb, who's going to be here today. Luckily, he's not here already, so he can't see how much I actually stole from him. But it was all with permission, I promise. The second reason I talk about this is because there's a lot of clinical trials available in myeloproliferative neoplasms, and it's important to know exactly what is being tested to get some of the basics of this, and to also understand what your role is in choosing among clinical trials. What's the best one for me, and what's actually being tested? For every home run, there's a lot of trials which are bunts that never make it to first base. And so figuring out what's the best way for you to get to the right trial for you to get to a drug that might really provide benefit means you need to know about the process. And that's what this talk is about. It's clinical trials sort of 101. So why should we discuss this? Clinical trial is not a real trial. It's a trial that often looks at the benefit, such as it might be, of a new medicine versus placebo, or sometimes on its own. And the main thing is that there's a lot of suspicion about clinical trials. You know, there's 100 times where people said, I don't want to be a guinea pig. And there's a reason why people say that. And people say that because there's a history of very poor trial, notorious and malignant even trials being conducted in this country. And so one of the benefits of that is we've learned from them. And now trials are conducted in a way that don't make people into guinea pigs, where there's adequate consent and adequate informed consent and adequate agreements between the participant, who is a peer in this process, and the investigator. So we're discussing this because there is actually a lot of information, and there's also very good data when you look at clinical trial processes that the more informed people are about clinical trials, the more they are likely to participate. And that's good. That means that the people on studies are really engaged and are helping to move this disease process and many others forward and helping us get better. I think part of the acceleration in the number of agents available for this and other cancers is this engagement of the communities, which is represented in this room. So we're going to talk about what a clinical trial is, what kind of oversight there is, why you should consider participating, and if you're offered one, what are those key things to learn before you're signing up. So some notorious and unethical trials. Many of you may have heard of these. Up here on this side, you'll see some references from pictures about the Tuskegee syphilis study. This is one of the biggest black marks on the American clinical trials, I would say, paradigm. This is a public health, federally funded public health study of syphilis in largely uneducated, poor, marginalized African Americans in the South. This was started before penicillin was approved, but these men were told that they were going to have some blood, they were being treated or they were going to be observed for bad blood. And during the course until 1972, none of these individuals who volunteered were told that there was now treatments for syphilis. At no time were they taken off the study, and many of them died of secondary and tertiary syphilis without ever having access to curative therapies. This has really, the lessons from that have changed the way we inform patients. They've changed the way we take patients off studies, and they've changed the level of obligation for us to make sure patients know about every advancement that's going on in the diseases that are being overseen. It's also set up a large federal government infrastructure that oversees a lot of trial processes. Another one here is this Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital. This is in New York City. These patients were infected with, without their consent, with cancer cells, live cancer cells. They were immune suppressed, and the question was whether or not they could catch cancer. Again, they were not consented adequately. Many of them were chronically ill. And again, it brings to the forefront of how consent and understanding that a patient needs to have some idea that they might benefit from a study is an important component. The last, this is a state school for children with cognitive impairment. There was a notice that many of the children that were initially, by the time they'd been in the school for about a year, became infected with hepatitis. And so somebody got the idea that they wanted to study how hepatitis was transmitted, and they ended up infecting kids who were placed here at the time that they were placed, so intentionally infecting them with hepatitis. Again, unconscionable in today's world, and unconscionable only because the lessons of these kinds of behaviors have been learned and disseminated and are actually a part of what we as investigators are taught very early in the learning how to be clinical researchers. So away from that, and let's talk a little bit about what a clinical trial is. It's also called a clinical study. So as you want to take a new medicine or a new intervention to market, the first thing is you do something called preclinical research. So when Dr. Savona is up here talking about mouse models or talking about xenografts or talking about this is what happens in cell lines, that is preclinical research. And that means that maybe a patient who has acute leukemia donates their cells. Those cells are grown in Petri dishes, and that new medicine might be dropped on those Petri dishes to see, do those cells die, for example. That's all preclinical. Now, if that works out, and if that means that those cells, hey, gosh, that Petri dish that we gave agent X to, a lot of those cells died. Well, maybe that's enough preclinical research to bring something into clinical trials. Within the clinical trial framework, and we're going to talk about phases, that's where the question is asked, does this medical intervention, is it safe when I give it to humans? Do I know the right dose when I give it to humans? And does it work? And the question has to be, is it safe? What's the dose? Does it work? Because you can't really know if something's going to work unless you know it's safe and it has the right dose. So there's steps that this happens. And finally, the drug then goes, if it's successful in this sort of pipeline, it goes to the market. And then the market sometimes says, well, it might have been safe in those 50 people in Akron that you gave it to, but it turns out that it's not safe when you give it to 100 million people around the country. So the part of here is sometimes a back check on here. If you have 1,000 medicines that go through preclinical research, you might get one that goes to market. And that actually reflects also on why medicines are so expensive. To some extent, they're expensive because pulling a medicine through this pipeline all the way means that there's a lot of work that goes into ones that never make it to market. So the question all clinical trials ask is, can a certain intervention impact an outcome? If I only eat bananas for 4 weeks, will I run faster in a 5K? Whatever that intervention is, whatever that outcome is, you need to define both ends of that. And the one that might be relevant to us is, does a new pill prevent spleen growth in patients with myelofibrosis? The first question, is that pill safe for humans? The second question is that pill safe for individuals with a specific cancer? So many times these pills are first tested in regular volunteers. Your 25-year-old at the graduate school who needs some extra cash volunteers and says, I'll take the new pill. And that person, so first it's safe for humans, and then you have to take it to people with cancer. Now, some medicines go directly to that right target spot, but some medicines you have to take a little bit to humans first. So when you're asking a question, when you're looking at a trial where it says first in human, that's something that your doctor might tell you when you're being consented. That means that you would be one of the first people to put this medicine in your mouth. It hasn't been tested on normal volunteers, okay? What's the right dose? Now, that's an interesting question because when you're in phase 1 study, so early, first in human, there may be a very, very, very small chance that you're going to get an effective dose. And that's because they first try it at 1/10 of the dose maybe, and then they might go up by a little bit and go up by a little bit. So when you're in a phase 1 study, it's very common that you will not start out at the effective dose because they have to start so low. They calculate that dose based on like what dose a rat got and died type of thing. And so they then translate it to humans. So one sort of buyer beware about being in a phase 1 study is you may not get what's eventually that effective dose. The next question is, do individuals taking the pill with myelofibrosis have any responses? We call this efficacy or signals of efficacy. Did some people's spleen shrink by like 5 centimeters? Well, that's a signal. Or in acute leukemia, did we get a decrease in those leukemia cells by a certain percentage? And do they have any particular toxicities? Sometimes people with myelofibrosis or ET are particularly vulnerable to certain toxicities, and those have to be checked. And finally, does the pill work better than the current standard of care to prolong life or to decrease spleen growth or to keep people out of the hospital, or do they have a better quality of life, or does their itching get better? And the only way to know that is to compare it against the standard of care. That's what's called a placebo control, or not really placebo, but a randomized control trial. So this just goes through those exact steps that we talked about. Phase 1 is about safety and tolerability. Drug doses start low. Phase 2 trials, they get an initial reading of efficacy, a signal of activity. Is it really worth moving this drug forward? Phase 3 trials, these are large, and when we say pivotal, that means that the outcome will change therapy. So the COMFORT studies, which tested ruxolitinib on myelofibrosis, were considered pivotal. They changed, the treatment of myelofibrosis was changed by that study. And so a study that's designed to be pivotal needs to be very large. It needs to have an outcome that will change the way something is treated. And so those are large studies, and often these studies are randomized. That means somebody flips a coin, and 50% of the patients are going to get maybe the standard of care or the standard of care plus a placebo, which is a dummy drug, a sugar pill, and half of them will get the standard of care plus the new drug, for example. And then phase 4 look to see, is this study really playing out when we put it in the larger group? So why should you consider participating? And I will tell you, when I talk to my patients about studies, I talk to them differently about a phase 1, 2, or 3 study. In a phase 3 study, I talk to this about people at all stages of their disease, newly diagnosed, relapsed refractory, etc. And the reason is because I think everybody will get the standard of care here, and these are unlikely, as certainly at this point, unlikely to see strange or new toxicities. As people's disease is worse or that there's less options out there, then I talk to them about little earlier phase studies. For example, a phase 2 study, if your disease is progressing and there's no great thing out on the market for you, then maybe phase 2 would be good, because there is a good chance, or at least some chance, that something that's already made it to phase 2 is safe. And what we'll be looking for is there a signal of efficacy? So in here, we're going to know the dose is at least a safe dose and hopefully the strongest dose. I treat a lot of acute leukemia also, and many of my patients have advanced through all the possible drugs, and that's when I start talking about phase 1 studies, because in phase 1, like we talked about, you may not be getting the right dose, and in a phase 1 study, you may be getting one of the many drugs that's never going to make it to be proven effective. So in a phase 1 study, I would say there's a lot more altruism being involved in that, because much of what we learn is going to benefit other people rather than benefit yourself. Whereas in a phase 3, it's more likely to provide some benefit to the patient. So when you're thinking about a trial, you're not only thinking about yourself, but you're also thinking, to what extent am I helping others to learn about this medicine and to help advance the field for the people that come behind me. And I would remind you that everybody here on ruxolitinib owes a debt to the people that were on that very first trial of ruxolitinib, who said, I will put this pill in my mouth, right? And that's a testament to really the community here. We're all here not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us. So who oversees clinical trials? The Food and Drug Administration does audits. For those of us who sat through a Food and Drug Administration audit, it is not a minor thing. It is quite extensive. And this happens both randomly and in a scheduled way for many of the clinical trials that are out there. Your local institutions, so if I work at MCW, Michael works at Vanderbilt, our local institution has review boards. A scientific review committee goes through every single trial that is written and says, is this valid? Is this worth putting patients on? Is this going to really show us something that's scientifically important? We have also a safety monitoring committee, and then financial disclosures. I don't make money if you sign up to a trial, but how would you know that? Well, you would know that because I declare every penny that comes in for research or for other work that I do as consultant, and it should not conflict. I should in no way gain from you being on a trial that I'm working on. Industry also has DSMC's, data safety monitoring committees. They have monitors that come, and that there is a pretty rapid turnaround of if a patient on Michael's study in Tennessee turns out that their hand turns blue, I learn about that within 24 hours. Hey, I have a patient on that study, and Michael's patient's hand turned blue, so that means I need to be alert to somebody with blue hands, right? So this kind of communication happens. So there are barriers to participating. There's a lack of information. There's this idea that you don't want to be a guinea pig, and that's realistic. If you don't want to be involved in testing something that might not benefit you but would benefit others, then you shouldn't be, because a lot of the part of this is, again, taking into account some risk. Importantly, there's time, travel, and financial constraints. So many times when you're in a clinical trial, you have to get the treatment at the place that signed you up, and that can be burdensome, especially in, for example, Wisconsin, where some of my patients travel 150, 200 miles to come to clinic, and for me to say, well, now you have to do that 3 times a week, that sometimes makes it completely infeasible to participate. There's concerns about receiving a low or ineffective dose. There's randomization questions. One of the things that Michael pointed out about the COMFORT trials is if you were on the placebo arm and you did worse, you were allowed to cross over and get the effective therapy. And that's something, again, to ask the doctor who's consenting you, is there crossover? If there's something effective, can I get it? There's concerns about whether or not everybody who ought to be in that trial is included. We have a lot of this is in AML, where new medicines are being tested only in people really without any other risk factors, or very healthy people. But when you go to clinic and you treat somebody with AML, it turns out they have a lot of comorbidities. And so the medicines that are getting approved aren't necessarily being approved in the right patient population. So the process of a clinical trial starts with informed consent. Then you go through a screening process, and that's where the clinical trial list of all the things that would allow you to be on the trial and not allow you to be on trial, which we call inclusion and exclusion criteria, are reviewed. So if this medicine is to test whether or not a new pill will help your heart function, and your heart function is perfect, maybe that screening will not allow you to enter because your heart function is perfect and there's no reason for you to take this pill, for example. Then you go on to enrollment and randomization. Not all trials are randomized. Some are, where there's a coin flip. Some are randomized 3-to-1, where 3 people get the investigation and 1 person doesn't, for example. And some people, everybody gets the medicine. Then you start the intervention, during which you're monitored for safety. Sometimes your dose is reduced. Adverse events are reported so that everybody else who's putting people on this trial will know what's happening. Gosh, Dr. Michaelis, her patient's hand turned blue, so we better, that's something we all have to keep an eye out for. And then there's end of treatment, where maybe the drug isn't working for you and your disease gets worse, so you come off. Or maybe the drug is working for you, but in 10 other people, there's some really catastrophic toxicity. And so the decision is made that even if you're benefiting, everybody comes off because the risk-benefit of the trial, of the treatment overall is not in favor. And that's the end of the study. Every patient should get information on what's happening on that trial. So for example, we presented information on this ruxolitinib and PI3 kinase study recently, and that was something that I talked to a few of my patients about. Well, we've got some information, this is what's being presented, et cetera. And that's because consent is a dialogue, it's not an event. Every time there's more information, I present it back to the patient. Every time they have more questions, they come back. I'm constantly telling people that signing these consents is not like a contract. It's not like a marriage. You can get out of it any time. And it also means you have to keep going back and forth. Informed consent is about disclosure. It's about understanding your ability to make a decision and that it's voluntary. I can't pay you $1,000 to join this study if you really need money, because that means it's not voluntary. It's coerced. I can't do this if you can't understand the language of the consent, or if you don't have the intellectual capacity to understand what you're consenting to, because that is not a free giving of risk to the process. I can't do it if I don't disclose that, oh, by the way, this company's paying me $1,000 for everybody I consent. That's a failure of disclosure. So informed consent discusses the nature of treatments, alternatives, what the potential benefits are and the risks, and gives you an opportunity for questions. And as I say, it's a process. It doesn't happen once. You might sign that paper once, but every time I see you, we go back over, well, this is what we're seeing. Do you have any questions? This is something that needs to continue to be an evolving process. And this just goes over a little bit about the details of informed consent and what needs to be included, what's being paid for. Is your insurance going to be charged for something that you might not have done because you weren't in the trial? And that it's always voluntary. A lot of times it's a very long conversation and can get really complicated. In my practice, I try not to talk about more than one trial at a time, because it just means that people get confused. And part of my job is to pick the trial that I think is the right trial to talk about at the right time with you at that stage in your disease, because otherwise I think people just get a little bit overwhelmed. There's a screening study, we talked about that. There might be some inclusion and exclusion criteria that you have to go through. You might have to go through a bone marrow biopsy. There might be certain studies done on your blood work that we want to check. And those are also part of the consent. And then there's this schedule. Well, here's what happens at the start. Here's what happens cycle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. One of the things I try and do is provide a calendar for everybody before they sign. So if you come and you're in this trial, that means you're going to have to show up here 3 times a week for the first 2 months. Well, if you live 300 miles away, that's not feasible, right? And people need to know that. That needs to be disclosed. What are the logistical barriers or the logistical requirements of a trial? When you're on a study, it's a typical visit. We do our test results. We make sure we go over the physical exam. We talk about any adverse events or abnormal lab events. And sometimes we have to change the study drug dose. And we also decide, is this working for you? Is there a reason for you to stay on the study? This is the end of treatment. Again, it's not a contract, it's an agreement. So that means at any point where you don't think it's right for you, or your doctor thinks there's something better, then both of you have an obligation to say that. This isn't right for me, or if I know that there's something better for you, I have an obligation to take you off study. And that's part of this agreement. Everybody comes to the table and brings something here, and you're as much a partner in this research as your physician is. I say, this says good clinical trial patient, but I would put good in quotation marks because, again, it's the clinical trial that needs to deliver to the patient, not the patient to the trial. And part of it is that you just really need to stay engaged. You have to understand the medicines that you're taking. You can't be taking 17 vitamin supplements and not tell me, because maybe this medicine that I'm giving you interacts with those vitamin supplements, and we need to review those things. You need to be basically adherent to some of the scheduling, and you have to recognize that by reporting a symptom, you're helping everybody else on that trial, not just yourself. So you say, no, doc, I really didn't want to tell you that my hand turned blue. I can live with it. I don't mind it. But remember, by telling me, you're helping every other person on that study whose hand might turn blue. It also just talks about that you keep diaries and that you're an advocate. Again, once you're in a clinical trial, you're an ambassador for a lot of other people. And that's a level of responsibility, and part of that is reporting. You want to think about, is the study free? Are the procedures paid for by the trial or by insurance? Are there any ways to defray lodging or travel expenses? And then you also want to make sure if there's words that you don't understand, that you ask about them. And part of it's just making sure you read that consent, but also don't feel silly if you're saying, look, I don't know what it means when you say double blind. Who's blind? Those kind of things are important. Okay, so clinical trials, last thing I just want to say is if you're looking for trials, look on clinicaltrials.gov. Look on these kind of NPN researches. And then I think a really good way to find out about this is through social media. Okay, I know I've overstayed, but thank you very much.